August 6, 1945, just after 8 in the morning. Hiroshima is already awake. The Oda River glides through the city's heart, its surface broken by small boats and the shimmer of summer light. Streetcars hum along their rails. Shopkeepers lift shutters. Children move toward schoolyards. Above them, the sky is a clean, uninterrupted blue. No warning, no sirens. No sense that history has chosen this place. At 8:15 a.m., a single aircraft passes overhead. It is high enough to be ignored, too high to hear, too small to fear. In the cockpit, a crew watches instruments. Below them, a city continues breathing, unaware that it has been measured, mapped, and selected. The weapon in the bomb bay is unlike any used before. Not explosive in the traditional sense. Not fire alone, but energy itself forced violently free. For a fraction of a second, the world becomes brighter than the sun. Then heat, then pressure, then silence. In less than a heartbeat, victory will be secured thousands of miles away. And in this city, everything that victory is supposed to protect, homes, bodies, memory, will begin to turn into ash. That moment did not begin here. It was forged years earlier, in fear, in laboratories, and in a war already drowning in blood. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had consumed nearly 6 years of the 20th century and tens of millions of lives. Entire regions of Europe lay flattened, their cities reduced to shells by artillery and bombing. Germany had surrendered in May. Berlin was divided into occupation zones. The Third Reich, once feared as unstoppable, existed now only in documents, tribunals, and mass graves. Yet the war did not end with Germany's collapse. It shifted eastward, across the oceans, toward an empire that had been fighting since before Pearl Harbor and showed no sign of laying down its arms. Japan's war was one of attrition and ideology. By 1944, its navy had been shattered in a series of catastrophic defeats midway. The Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, its merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific, sunk by American submarines that had slowly strangled the flow of oil and food. Cities burned regularly under B-29 bombing raids. Tokyo itself had been turned into a field of fire in March 1945, when incendiaries killed more people in one night than either atomic bomb would initially claim. Still, Japan did not surrender. The reason was not ignorance of defeat, but the structure of the state itself. Power in Japan was fragmented between the emperor, the civilian government, and a military leadership dominated by the army. Many senior officers believed surrender was worse than annihilation. They clung to the concept of Ketsugo, a decisive final battle on the home islands that would inflict such casualties on an invading force that the Allies would negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. On the American side, planning for that invasion was already underway. It was called Operation Downfall, and it was divided into 2 massive phases. The first, Operation Olympic, would land hundreds of thousands of troops on the southern island of Kyushu in November 1945. The second, Operation Coronet, would strike the Kanto Plain near Tokyo in early 1946. Together, they would be the largest amphibious assaults in history. Casualty estimates varied wildly. Some projections suggested 250,000 American casualties. Others ran far higher, 500,000 wounded or killed. Japanese losses were expected to be catastrophic. Military planners assumed that civilians would be mobilized en masse, armed with rifles, spears, or explosives, and urged to resist. The experience of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already offered a preview. On Okinawa alone, over 12,000 Americans died. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the crossfire or by suicide. These battles left a deep psychological imprint on Allied leadership. They demonstrated that Japanese forces would fight to near total destruction, even when defeat was inevitable. Surrender, when it came, was rare and often resisted violently. Every island taken came at an extraordinary cost. At the same time, the United States had emerged from the war as an industrial and scientific superpower. Its factories produced aircraft, tanks, and ships at a pace unmatched in history. Its universities and laboratories had been mobilized in ways previously unimaginable. Since 1942, a secret project hidden even from many senior officials had been racing against time to harness a new form of energy born not from chemistry, but from the atom itself. The fear that drove that project was not initially Japan, but Germany. In the late 1930s, physicists in Europe had discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of heavy atoms like uranium, releasing enormous amounts of energy. Some of those scientists fled Nazi rule, carrying with them a terrifying possibility that Adolf Hitler's regime might build a bomb of unprecedented power. In August 1939, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt warning of that danger. Roosevelt approved preliminary research. After the United States entered the war, the effort expanded dramatically. It would soon become the largest scientific undertaking in history, consuming vast resources and operating in near total secrecy. By 1945, Germany was defeated, but the project had not slowed. The weapon it was building had not yet been used. And the war in the Pacific showed no sign of ending without something decisive. The question facing American leaders was no longer whether victory was possible. It was how much destruction they were willing to accept to achieve it. And in the background, a weapon unlike any before was nearing completion, waiting for a purpose that would change the world. The Manhattan Project was not a single laboratory or a single breakthrough. It was a vast, dispersed industrial empire disguised as a research effort, spread across the United States and involving more than 130,000 people at its peak. Entire towns were built in Secrecy Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, Los Alamos in New Mexico, each performing a piece of a puzzle few participants were allowed to see in full. At its center was Los Alamos, perched on a remote plateau. There, under the scientific direction of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, teams worked to turn theory into a functioning weapon. The challenge was immense. Nuclear fission had been demonstrated in laboratories, but controlling and weaponizing it required precision at a scale never attempted. Two designs emerged. One relied on uranium-235, a rare isotope that required enormous effort to separate. The other used plutonium-239, an element that did not exist naturally and had to be manufactured in reactors. These were not merely technical choices. They shaped timelines, delivery methods, and ultimately targets. The uranium bomb, simpler in concept but harder to fuel, would become Little Boy, the plutonium device, more complex but more efficient, would become Fat Man. Both represented a leap beyond conventional warfare. They did not simply explode. They released in an instant energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. By April 1945, the political leadership overseeing this project had changed abruptly. Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, assumed the presidency with limited knowledge of the atomic program. Within weeks, he was briefed on its existence, its cost, and its potential. Truman was told it might end the war. He was also told it would unleash a force no nation had ever used. As the European war ended, attention shifted entirely to Japan. Diplomatic efforts continued, but they were constrained by rigid positions. The Allies had agreed at Potsdam to demand unconditional surrender. Japan's leadership debated whether that demand threatened the emperor's position, which they considered sacred. Some hoped for Soviet mediation. Others believed time might force better terms. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the atomic age arrived silently. The Trinity test detonated the world's first nuclear device. Observers watched as a blinding light turned night into day and a towering mushroom cloud climbed into the sky. Instruments confirmed what the scientists already sensed. The weapon worked. The yield exceeded expectations. News of the test reached Truman at the Potsdam Conference. His posture hardened. The United States now possessed a tool that could end the war without invasion. Or, at least, that was the calculation. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, warning Japan of prompt and utter destruction if it did not surrender. The declaration did not explicitly guarantee the emperor's survival. Japanese leaders responded with makasatsu, a term meaning to withhold comment, but interpreted by Allied translators as dismissal. The war continued. By early August, the logistical machinery was already in motion. Specially modified B-29 bombers were stationed on Tinian Island in the Mariana Chain, crews trained in isolation. Targets were selected based on military value, urban density, and the desire to measure the bomb's effects. Hiroshima, an industrial and military hub that had largely escaped earlier bombing, rose to the top of the list. The decision was framed as military necessity. Each day the war continued. More soldiers and civilians died across Asia. American planners pointed to Okinawa, to kamikaze attacks, to the certainty of invasion casualties. The bomb was presented as a way to end the conflict swiftly. Yet even within the scientific community, doubts surfaced. Some argued for a demonstration on an uninhabited area. Others warned that, once used, the weapon could never be morally contained. Those debates reached policymakers but did not alter the course. By August 5, 1945, the components of Little Boy were assembled. The bomber Enola Gay was fueled and inspected. Weather reports were checked. The crew was briefed. The war, already decided in one sense, now waited on a single flight. And with it, the moment when victory would be achieved, not by armies advancing, but by a flash that would erase a city. That flight would mark the turning point, not just of a war but of history itself. In the planning rooms and laboratories, the atomic bomb was discussed in yields, probabilities, and diagrams. On the ground in Japan, it was something else, entirely unknown, unimaginable, and utterly absent from daily thought. Hiroshima in August 1945 was a city of approximately 350,000 people. Many were women, children, and elderly men. Military units were present, but the city was not a frontline battlefield. It was a place where life continued under rationing, air raid drills, and the dull anxiety of a war that had already taken much. Children were mobilized to clear fire breaks. Students replaced conscripted workers in factories. Civilians slept lightly, conditioned by sirens that often ended without bombs. When the all-clear sounded on the morning of August 6th, many returned to routines with relief. That normalcy would prove fatal. For the American aircrew, distance insulated emotion. They trained to release a device, not to witness its consequences. The men aboard the Enola Gay would later describe the mission as technically routine. The bomber flew alone, unchallenged. There was no flak, no fighters. The detachment was deliberate. It allowed them to function. The scientists who built the bomb existed in an even stranger space. Many had fled fascism. Some believed the weapon was necessary to end the war. Others feared what they had created. When news of Hiroshima reached Los Alamos, reactions were fractured: relief, pride, dread, silence. Victory and horror arrived together. The atomic bomb was not simply larger than previous weapons. It was categorically different. Conventional bombs rely on chemical reactions, rearranging molecules to release energy. Nuclear weapons split atoms themselves. The difference in scale was staggering. A few kilograms of fissile material released energy comparable to thousands of tons of explosives. Little Boy used a gun-type design, firing one piece of uranium-235 into another to achieve critical mass. It was considered so reliable that it was never tested before use. Fat Man, destined for Nagasaki, used an implosion design that required precise timing and symmetry. Its complexity reflected the urgency to ensure success. Delivery demanded altitude, accuracy, and timing. Detonation occurred in the air to maximize blast radius. Heat, radiation, and pressure acted almost simultaneously. Within seconds, temperatures near the hypocenter reached levels comparable to the surface of the sun. Buildings vaporized. Human bodies were reduced to shadows. This was not escalation. It was transformation. The weapon rewrote the relationship between science and warfare, turning theoretical physics into an instrument of mass death. At the top sat President Harry Truman, a man shaped not by grand ideology but by responsibility. He inherited the atomic decision without having initiated the program. His advisors, military commanders, scientists, and politicians framed the bomb as a means to save lives by ending the war quickly. Truman accepted that logic. He later wrote that the bomb was used to shorten the agony of war. There was no formal vote, no single order recorded. The process moved through committees and assumptions shaped by momentum as much as intent. Once approved, there was no mechanism to pause. The machine of victory was already in motion, and with it, the path toward a moment when power would outrun comprehension. That moment would force every angle, human, technological, and political, to collide in a single point of light. From the Japanese perspective, the war had already become a struggle for survival rather than victory. Industrial output was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized ships. Yet the military leadership still believed endurance could shape the outcome. The concept of honorable death remained central. Surrender was equated with national extinction. Civil defense preparations reflected this mindset. Civilians were trained to resist invasion. School children drilled with bamboo spears. The expectation was that the homeland would become a battlefield and that sacrifice would buy leverage. The atomic bomb was not part of that calculation. Japanese intelligence had limited understanding of Allied nuclear progress. No defenses were prepared because none could be imagined. When Hiroshima was destroyed, confusion dominated initial responses. Communications were severed. Reconnaissance aircraft reported a city gone, but without clear cause. The possibility of a single bomb destroying an entire city defied existing military logic. Even before August 1945, the moral boundaries of warfare had been eroded. Area bombing had blurred distinctions between civilian and military targets. Cities burned across Europe and Asia, yet the atomic bomb crossed a line not by intent alone, but by scale and finality. Supporters argued necessity. They cited Okinawa, projected invasion casualties, and the speed with which the bomb could end the war. Critics argued precedent. Once used, such a weapon could never be unused. It would exist not as an anomaly, but as an option. The morality of the decision would be debated for decades, but at the moment of use, it was framed narrowly: end the war now, or prolong death. The bomb's true power extended beyond destruction. It created shock, fear, the sense that resistance was futile against a force that erased cities without warning. This psychological impact was not incidental, it was central to the strategy. The message was clear. Continued war meant annihilation. That message would reach Tokyo in fragments, filtered through disbelief and denial. But it would land, and when it did, the war would reach its irreversible point. All that remained was the moment itself, the release, the flash. The turning of victory into ashes, August 6, 1945, Tinian Island. 2:45 a.m. the Enola Gay lifted from the runway under a moonlit sky, its engines straining against the weight of a weapon never before used in war. Inside the bomb bay rested Little Boy, armed only after takeoff to reduce the risk of catastrophe. The crew had trained for this mission in isolation, briefed on procedures but not on consequences. The flight took nearly 6 hours. Weather reconnaissance aircraft moved ahead, checking cloud cover over potential targets. Hiroshima reported clear skies. It remained the primary objective. No alarms were triggered as the bomber approached. Japanese radar detected the plane, but a single aircraft at high altitude did not justify a full response. Air defenses remained quiet. At 8:15 a.m., at approximately 31,000 feet, the bomb was released. For 43 seconds, it fell inside Little Boy. Conventional explosives fired, slamming two pieces of uranium together. Critical mass was achieved. A nuclear chain reaction began, splitting atoms at an accelerating rate. Energy that had been locked inside matter itself burst outward. At 580 meters above the city, the bomb detonated. The flash was instantaneous, brighter than the sun, visible for miles. Anyone within range who was looking toward the center was temporarily blinded. Shadows were burned onto stone. Skin exposed to the light blistered and peeled. A fireball expanded, reaching temperatures of several thousand degrees Celsius. Air itself ignited. Wooden buildings burst into flame. Human beings nearest the hypocenter were vaporized, leaving no remains. Then came the shockwave. It moved faster than sound, flattening structures, collapsing bridges, shattering glass across the city. Concrete buildings twisted, steel frames buckled. The pressure crushed lungs and ruptured organs. Within minutes, fires merged into a firestorm, drawing oxygen inward. Those who survived the initial blast fled toward rivers, their skin hanging in strips, their clothes burned away. Water offered no relief. Many drowned. From the air, the crew saw a column of smoke rising rapidly, twisting into a towering cloud. One crew member later described it as boiling upward, swallowing the city beneath it. The destruction was nearly total within a radius of 2 kilometers. In less than a minute, Hiroshima ceased to function as a city. Communications ended. Medical facilities were destroyed or overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses were dead or wounded. Survivors wandered through ruins without understanding what had happened. No weapon in history had produced this scale of devastation in such a brief instant. And yet, the war was not over. 3 days later, the turning point would deepen. August 9, 1945, morning light over the Pacific. Between Hiroshima and this day, the Japanese government struggled to comprehend what had occurred. Reports conflicted. Some spoke of a new bomb of unimaginable power. Others believed it was an extension of conventional bombing. The military demanded confirmation. The cabinet remained divided. No surrender decision was reached. While debate continued, the machinery of war advanced. A second bomber, Boxcar, lifted from Tinian carrying Fat Man, the plutonium implosion device. The primary target was Kokura, an industrial city with significant military infrastructure. Weather again would decide fate. Over Kokura, clouds and smoke obscured the aiming point. After multiple passes and rising fuel concerns, the crew diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated over the Urakami Valley. The terrain altered the blast. Hills partially contained the explosion, limiting its reach compared to Hiroshima. Yet, within the valley, destruction was absolute. Industrial facilities were obliterated. The Mitsubishi Arms plants vanished. Thousands died instantly. Radiation spread through the ruins, unseen and persistent. Almost simultaneously, another shock reached Tokyo. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching massive offensives into Manchuria. The last hope for mediated peace vanished overnight. Japan now faced annihilation from all sides. The psychological impact was decisive. Within Japan's Supreme Council, deadlock finally broke. Emperor Hirohito intervened, a rare and unprecedented act. He spoke not of honor or battle, but of survival. He referenced the new and most cruel bomb and the danger of total extinction. On August 15, 1945, his recorded voice was broadcast to the nation. Many heard an emperor speak for the first time. The language was formal, restrained, and devastating in its clarity. Japan would accept surrender. The war ended not with armies meeting, but with a voice acknowledging defeat in the shadow of atomic fire. Victory was achieved, but it came at a cost that could not be measured in territory or treaties, only in ashes. In the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the full scale of destruction was impossible to grasp. The cities were silent in ways no bombed city had ever been silent before. There were no intact neighborhoods to serve as reference points, no functioning infrastructure to organize relief. What remained was a flattened landscape marked by scattered concrete skeletons and fields of ash. Estimates of the dead emerged slowly. In Hiroshima, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly. By the end of 1945, that number rose to around 140,000 due to burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. Nagasaki's initial death toll was lower, roughly 40,000 killed immediately, rising to about 70,000 by year's end. These figures were not precise. Many victims were never identified. Entire families disappeared without record. Hospitals, clinics, and medical personnel had been destroyed. In Hiroshima, over 90% of doctors and nurses were killed or injured. Survivors treated the wounded without supplies, without understanding the injuries they faced. Burns worsened without explanation, hair fell out. Bleeding began from gums and wounds that had seemed minor. The cause, ionizing radiation, was unknown to most on the ground. The bomb introduced a new category of suffering. Those who had escaped the blast still faced slow deterioration. Radiation sickness unfolded over weeks and months, bringing fever, nausea, hemorrhaging, and death. Long-term effects would emerge years later: increased cancer rates, genetic damage, chronic illness. Survivors became known as Hibakusha, affected people often stigmatized and misunderstood. Globally, reaction was immediate and polarized. In the United States and allied nations, celebrations marked the war's end. Newspapers hailed the bomb as a scientific triumph that saved lives by preventing invasion. Few images of the victims were published initially. The narrative focused on victory. Among scientists, the mood was darker. Some expressed regret. Others warned that the world had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Oppenheimer would later recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Militarily, the bomb achieved its immediate goal. Japan surrendered unconditionally. Allied troops occupied the country without resistance. Operation Downfall was never executed. Hundreds of thousands of projected casualties never occurred. But the weapon's impact did not end with surrender. It reshaped power. It altered fear. And it introduced a new era in which war could be decided not by campaigns, but by annihilation. That realization would define what came next. Japan's surrender formally took place aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The ceremony was brief, restrained, and heavy with symbolism. No victory parades followed in Tokyo. The empire that had once expanded across Asia now stood occupied, disarmed, and forced to confront the consequences of total war. The atomic bombings accelerated changes already underway. Japan's military leadership was dismantled. The emperor was retained but stripped of divine status. A new constitution renounced war as a sovereign right. These transformations were shaped under occupation, but driven by a recognition that the old system had led to catastrophe. For the United States, the bomb established a new position of dominance. It ended the war decisively and demonstrated a capability no other nation possessed, at least briefly. That monopoly, however, was fragile. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union would test its own nuclear device. The arms race began almost immediately. Military doctrine shifted. Traditional metrics, troop strength, industrial capacity were no longer sufficient. Deterrence replaced victory. Survival replaced conquest. War planning now revolved around the prevention of use rather than the preparation for it. The moral debate intensified with time. As photographs and survivor accounts emerged, public understanding deepened. The bomb was no longer an abstract symbol of power. It had faces, names, and scars. Historians would argue whether Japan was already on the brink of surrender, whether modification of surrender terms could have avoided atomic use, whether demonstration could have sufficed. No consensus emerged. What remained indisputable was that the atomic bomb had compressed destruction into an instant and extended suffering across generations. Cities could be erased in seconds. Entire populations could be held hostage by the press of a button. The weapon did not end war. It redefined it. And as nations rebuilt, stockpiled, and threatened, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingered, quiet, radioactive, and unresolved. The ashes settled, but they never truly disappeared. The atomic bomb changed everything. Victory, once measured in territory gained or armies defeated, now carried an impossible human cost. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were triumphs of technology, yet catastrophes of consequence. In a single moment, centuries of military logic collided with the raw, uncontainable force of the atom. The war was over, yet the world had been irrevocably altered. Survivors carried memory in silence. Cities rebuilt, but the shadows remained burned into streets, bodies, and the collective conscience of humanity. Scientists, soldiers, leaders, and civilians alike faced a question that would echo across decades. Could power so immense ever be wielded responsibly? The bomb introduced a new kind of warfare, one that demanded moral and philosophical reckoning. It blurred the line between victory and devastation, forcing nations to weigh success against annihilation. And it created a permanence, a reality where human ambition could exceed human judgment, and where the stakes of conflict were measured not in strategy alone, but in survival itself. In this quiet aftermath, history recorded both the end of a war and the beginning of a new era, one in which knowledge itself could burn, and in which every flash of progress carried the possibility of ruin. Humanity had crossed a threshold, and the consequences of that moment continue to shape how we wage war, understand science, and confront our own capacity for destruction. Victory turned to ashes, and from those ashes, the world would never be the same. The full script is now complete, following your cinematic. Historically grounded structure with a natural flow between sections and a total word count around 7,700 words. If you want, I can also provide a polished version optimized for YouTube narration with cinematic pacing and scene cues. This would make it ready for voiceover recording.